I wish to welcome you. In particular, I would like to thank the distinguished members of the panel who will comment on the book entitled Our Duty is to Struggle, which came through from Fidel meeting with a group of intellectuals from different countries present in the Havana Book International Fair. I do not intend to make any comments that belong to the distinguished member of the panel. Also belong to you, you want to make any intervention. I just want to refer to the presence of Fidel in such occasion. During more than 9 hours, Fidel listened attentively to all the participants who took the floor. He told them, I came to listen, not to talk. Nevertheless, Fidel did not miss the opportunity to ask questions and comment on different topics. Without any intention of comparison, he reminds me of Socrates. 20 years ago, the Earth Summit was held in Rio de Janeiro. 125 heads of state were present. Fidel delivered a speech that lasted 7 minutes. I remember very well this speech, which began, an important biological species is in danger to the accelerated and progressive destruction of its natural living condition, man. The media group of about 600 reporters ranking Fidel's speech as the first among all speech delivered. My conclusion is that Fidel has a characteristic among many others that allow him to convey his ideas without a sign of the connection during 9 hours or 7 minutes, addressing them in depth and capturing the full attention of the audience. I finish for good. And I pass over. Thank you for the applause. It wasn't on the script. I pass over to Jacomino.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. Well, we are here today to launch this important, insightful book, and we have with us in this panel a number of very dear and very respected persons that we want to thank for their presence. José Pertierra, next to me. Pertierra is an attorney here in D.C. He's also Cuban, by the way. He represents the government of Venezuela. He has represented in several important cases, including the case for the extradition of self-confessed criminal Luis Posada Carriles. He has also been involved in several important, major, high-profile cases over the years in his practice as a lawyer. The case of Elian Gonzalez, the Cuban child, the case of Sister Diana Ortiz, the case of Efrain Bamaca Velasquez. He is also, by the way, a recipient of Cuba's Journalism Award, the Felix El Musa Award, which he just got very recently, a few months ago, Pertierra, right? Welcome, Pertierra, thank you, and it's great to have you with us. Next to us we have Dan Whittle. Dan is the director of the Cuba program in the Environmental Defense Fund, the EDF, that works to advance conservation of marine and coastal ecosystems in Cuba. He has been working with Cuban scientists, lawyers, and resource managers to identify and implement cooperation strategies for fisheries management, coral reef conservation, and sustainable coastal development in Cuba and in the region. We are more than happy to have you, Dan, with us today. We also have with us Stuart Ashman in the middle. Stuart, thank you for being with us, Stuart. Stuart is the president and the chief executive officer of the Museum of Latin American Art in Los Angeles. Stuart has served as director of the Museum of Fine Arts, Museum of New Mexico. He was also founding director of the Museum of Spanish Colonial Art in Santa Fe. Ashman, by the way, served as cabinet secretary for the state of New Mexico, the Department of Cultural Affairs, for more than 7 years. We're very happy to have you with us, Ashman, and welcome. And least but not least, of course, we have Brian Becker at the end of the table. Brian, the national coordinator of the Answer Coalition. Answer, as you know, standing for Act Now to Stop War and End Racism. The Answer Coalition is a United States-based protest umbrella group that consists of anti-war and civil rights organizations. Before I give the floor to the panelists to listen to what they have to say on this important book that we are presenting today, and which is being presented in several capitals of the world at the moment, including in Havana, where they are, I'm sure they're watching us. A number of important people. Do we know, Ambassador, about what Havana is? Well, we know for sure that in Havana they're watching us as we go. But I wanted to introduce over the phone someone who is not with us, couldn't make it, but who was there in the hours of discussion with Fidel Castro on February the 10th that resulted in this book today. I'm speaking about Professor Peter Phillips of Sonoma State University. Peter Phillips is a sociology professor, but Phillips is was the director for many years of Project Censored. Peter is also the president, and we will be right with you, Peter. Peter is the president of the Media Freedom Foundation, a non-profit organization working closely with Project Censored and other investigative research and media-related entities. Of course, the mission of Project Censored, as you probably know, is to teach students and the public in general about the role of a free press in a free society and telling the news that didn't make the news and why they didn't make them. That's our job. Peter Phillips, that's a book they issue every year. And if we have Peter Phillips with us, whom I had the chance to interview in Havana and met a couple of years ago, Phillips, if he's with us, we are ready to listen to what you have to say.
Well, thank you very much. I certainly enjoyed the trip down to the International Book Fair, and I wrote an article which is posted on the Project Censored website, both in English and then on our Proyecto Censurado site in Spanish. And it's entitled, "Cuba Sets a Global Example for the Achievements of Socialism." And I described the all-day conference, which was held February 10th, 2012, and there was about 120 authors, professors, and journalists from dozens of Caribbean American and African countries, they met with Fidel Castro. These meetings those attending were invited participants for the intellectual encounters for peace and preservation of the environment, which was held at the Havana Convention Center. Some of the main topics during the 9-hour session were world peace, environmentalism, neoliberal capitalism, and the continuing importance of socialism. Fidel Castro urged those assembled to a moral duty to prevent the extinction of humankind and challenge the expanding predations of the neoliberal global capitalism. He expressed concern for the inevitable collapse of Wall Street and the international monetary system. Paper money is worthless without backing from gold or other assets, Castro stated. Environmental destruction is classless in that eventually all will suffer, both rich and poor, if neoliberal capitalism continues on its rampant global destruction. Castro's main message was clear. Cuban socialism is an international example of humanitarian economy in the world. We have over 80,000 doctors, he said, and we are currently training 830 Pakistani medical students and many others from around the world. Fidel Castro was reverently referred to as the Comandante by many of those present, and was flanked by the Cuban Minister of Culture, Abel Prieto, and the President of the Cuban Book Institute, Zuleika Romay. The participants in the encounter were invited guests to the 2012 International Cuban Book Fair that started on February 10th in Havana. The 9-hour session went from 1 p.m. until 10 p.m. with only 2 short coffee breaks. Fidel gave extended responses during the event, commenting on the presentations, asking questions, recalling the history of the Cuban Revolution and Cuba's humanitarian efforts over the past 50 years. Some 40 people presented briefings on their concerns. The lies and propaganda of the corporate capitalist media were important themes for the day. One participant remarked how the global corporate media seeks to create a monoculture of the mind inside the capitalist countries. As an invited author for the International Cuban Book Fair, I was honored to participate in the discussions held with the Comandante. His energy is inspiring and his command of history and contemporary issues is phenomenal. Fidel Castro had serious health issues a few years back, but remains mentally alert. He walked with assistance from his bodyguards, but remained fully participatory in the 9-hour session. Cuba is an international example of the potentialities of socialism and an ongoing symbolic challenge to marketplace capitalism. In the United States, there's a continuing propaganda drumbeat against the Cuban Revolution. Castro is often referred to as a military dictator, repressing his people and blocking freedoms in Cuba. But this description ignores some undisputed social advances under his leadership that could serve as an example of what a society can do when it turns its resources to humanitarian purposes. Contemporary neoliberal capitalism undercuts wages, unions, and social welfare, which results in an expansion of poverty, hunger, and extreme inequality worldwide. Cuba is a demonstration that humanitarian socialism can work for the masses. Cuba is the #1 organic farming country in the world. Cuba has full employment, zero starvation, some of the best health care in the world. Cuba's life expectancy is equal to the United States, and education up through university is paid for by the state for all students. As a media reform activist and participant, I watched tens of thousands of young people arrive at the International Book Fair in the old Spanish fort overlooking downtown Havana. These are multi-generations of people who have never suffered media advertisement. 3 University of Havana literature majors with whom I spent a full day laughed hysterically when I asked them if they wanted a McDonald's Happy Meal. They represent a people who accept the equality of socialism and the collective growth of human betterment, and will strongly defend their ways of life if necessary. As literature majors, they had completed 3 years of Latin. They were studying classical Greek. They have had courses in historical and modern Latin American and European literature and art. Their university education costs them nothing, and the government provides textbooks and living expenses. After the collapse of the USSR, Cuba lost most of its subsidies from the socialist bloc of nations. The early 1990s were a difficult transition. This was when Cuba opened its doors to those who wanted to leave. Some 30,000 people chose to move to the United States, yet 10 million people chose to stay, and build the independent socialist country that is Cuba today. Several other South American countries, notably Venezuela and Ecuador, have taken note of Cuba's successes and are moving in a similar direction, seeking socialist equality. Some people in the U.S. believe that when the senior Cuban leadership from the 1959 revolution passes away, U.S. corporations and displaced Cubans will waltz back into Havana to return capitalism to the island. It is clear to me and many contemporary observers that multiple generations of socialist Cubans will never allow this to happen. So all in all, it was a really great experience. I was very wonderful to be there, particularly the day I spent with Fidel Castro and the day that I spent with the students from the University of La Habana. I will be in touch with them. They hope to be writing for Proyecto Censurado and keeping all of our students and our network of universities worldwide aware of what's been happening in Cuba.
Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for your kind and numerous kind words about Cuba. And thank you for the description of the book and your stay in Havana. Looking forward to seeing you again. Keep up the good work with Project Censor. All the best to you. Thank you. Without further delay, our pleasure, Peter. Without further delay now, thank you. Without further delay, I'd like to pass on the word now to lawyer José Pertierra, next to us. Pertierra, thank you for being with us. Eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Jacomino. It's very difficult to speak in English in this embassy. I am Cuban, and it's very, very difficult for me. So I'm going to speak in Spanish. Muchas gracias, Jacomino. Muchas gracias, distinguido embajador Bolaños, el distinguido encargado de negocio de la Embajada de Venezuela, Ángelo Rivero Santos, que está con nosotros. Yo lo que quería era hablar un poquito del libro. Me lo leí este fin de semana. El embajador Bolaños me lo encargó y me pasé el sábado leyéndolo y vale la pena, se lo recomiendo. Este libro, Nuestro deber es luchar, como se llama, recoge la conversación entre el comandante Fidel Castro y 117 intelectuales en La Habana el pasado 10 de febrero. Fue un diálogo poco común en torno al futuro del planeta y de la especie humana, frente al posible uso de armas nucleares por los países más poderosos del mundo. Giró sobre lo que pudiera ocurrir mañana mismo o pasado mañana, en lo que cabría también asuntos no menos urgentes como el agotamiento de los recursos naturales, la manipulación de los medios transnacionales y otros temas históricos que impactan nuestro presente y nuestro futuro inmediato. El escritor Daniel Chavarría, en el diálogo con el comandante, le planteó lo siguiente. Le dijo Chavarría que si en este mundo que está a punto de irse a bolina y con un problema enorme a cuestas, él tenía que acabar de alarmarse o quedarse tranquilo. Fidel le respondió sin titubear: para quedarse tranquilo hay que pensar en el problema y luchar contra él. Pensar en el problema para luchar del mejor modo contra él es precisamente el propósito del conversatorio que encontrarán en este libro. Para Fidel, lo más peligroso es que los poderosos hoy controlan cada vez menos los demonios que han desatado. Ejemplificó con la situación de los norteamericanos y europeos en Afganistán e Irak, donde, como dijo Fidel, no pueden quedarse ni pueden irse. La directora del Instituto del Libro, Zuleika Romay, abrió el encuentro en La Habana con una brillante ponencia que sirve como la introducción al libro, tocando temas tan trascendentes como la sobrevivencia de la especie humana, la crisis sistémica del capitalismo, la crisis ecológica y la manipulación de los medios de comunicación. Zuleika abrió el abanico de temas para los participantes, quienes compartieron más de 9 horas con el comandante de la Revolución Cubana. Fidel, siempre pragmático, varias veces recordó a los intelectuales que hay que explicar en inglés, cosa que no estoy haciendo yo, pero los compañeros que están a mi lado sí lo van a hacer. porque, como dijo Fidel, hay que explicarle estas verdades a los yanquis, a los ingleses y otros muchos, para que las conozcan. Una de las más interesantes conversaciones fue con el premio Nobel argentino Adolfo Pérez Esquivel, quien dijo: en América Latina nosotros vivimos indignados, no tienen que enseñarnos a ser indignados. Citó al filósofo francés del siglo pasado, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, quien decía que un revolucionario no se hace a través de la ciencia, sino de la indignación frente a las injusticias, al hambre, a la pobreza y a la explotación. La pregunta que queda entonces es, ¿qué hacemos frente a esto? Esquivel siguió: estamos tratando de experimentar, de ir construyendo nuevos caminos, de ir abriendo espacios, de tratar de compartir con los sectores populares. Creo que los intelectuales tienen que tener ese acercamiento a las bases. Y sigue diciendo: muchas veces cuando viajo para compartir a las favelas, a las villas, a los tugurios, a las casas de brujas, ahí nos encontramos con la sabiduría de los pueblos, sus luchas y esperanzas. La sabiduría no es de aquel que lee más libros, la sabiduría es de aquellos que comprenden el sentido profundo de la vida. Pérez Esquivel sabe que no tenemos recetas, pero que las conversaciones con el pueblo, con los pobres de la tierra, son las que iluminan el camino. Más adelante intervino el teólogo Frei Beto, citando la famosa frase de Gramsci: el pueblo vivencia, pero muchas veces no comprende su situación. Nosotros, intelectuales, comprendemos la realidad, pero no la vivenciamos. Hay que tener las dos cosas. Primero, un proyecto con metas, y segundo, raíces populares, contacto con el pueblo. Esa tesis es el hilo conductor de este importante encuentro de Fidel con los intelectuales que ustedes pueden ver en este libro. Un intercambio sumamente interesante protagonizaron el ex ministro de Cultura venezolano Farruko Sesto y el comandante Fidel Castro. Farruko ahora se encarga de la reconstrucción de Caracas y tiene mucho que reconstruir ahí. Sus palabras inspiraron a Fidel, que recordó los días en 1959, cuando había ido a Caracas para darle las gracias al gobierno provisional presidido por el almirante Larrazábal, que sucedió al derrocado gobierno de Pérez Jiménez. Fidel agradeció a Larrazábal y dijo: lo que valía sobre todo era lo que Venezuela hizo, porque al atreverse a enviarnos las armas aquellas, dijo Fidel, fue un gesto que nos agradó mucho, dice Fidel, y era deber elemental expresarle a los venezolanos nuestra gratitud. Fidel, por supuesto, se refería a la campaña venezolana Un Bolívar para la Sierra, que logró reunir más de 1 millón de bolívares en fondos para el ejército rebelde. Con esos fondos se pudo enviar una gran cantidad de armas a los rebeldes del 26 de julio hasta la Sierra Maestra. Fidel quedó eternamente agradecido con el pueblo venezolano y al almirante Larrazábal le escribió una carta donde termina diciéndole: desde hoy le digo que cualquiera que sea la posición que usted ocupa en su país, la más alta o la más modesta, para nosotros será siempre el primero de los venezolanos. En aquel entonces Hugo Chávez Frías tenía solamente 5 años. Durante su conversación con Farruko, Fidel contó cómo ahora el presidente Chávez, con las ideas y los sueños de Bolívar, puede conducir un país tan rico y a la vez tan saqueado como Venezuela, a ser protagonista de su propio destino, a que sea el pueblo y no las petroleras extranjeras el que goza de los recursos del país. Eso, dijo Fidel, es lo que significa la revolución bolivariana. América Latina ha cambiado. Los países de nuestra América no son más las colonias bananeras de los Estados Unidos. Tenemos el ALBA, UNASUR y ahora la Comunidad de Estados Latinoamericanos y del Caribe, la CELAC, una iniciativa regional sin esos dos países al norte de América, Estados Unidos y Canadá. Fíjate, no en Norteamérica, el norte de América. Los nuevos proyectos políticos y económicos de integración son nuestros y no de ellos. Las decisiones de los países de América ahora se toman en nuestras capitales y no en Washington o en Miami. Ahí surgen nuevos retos que tenemos que identificar, colegiar y resolver. Es el sueño de Bolívar y Martí realizado, el sueño de nuestra América. Pero como se puede vislumbrar en este libro, nos enfrentamos con enormes obstáculos internos y externos, que vistos en su conjunto parecerían insuperables, y quizás lo sean si nos paralizamos y si no atendemos al llamado de este libro, al deber de luchar con que nos reta desde el mismo título. Gracias al liderazgo revolucionario del presidente Chávez y del comandante Fidel Castro, la integración de América Latina se acerca a la realidad. Y los lazos entre Cuba y Venezuela hoy son más fuertes que nunca. Se los digo yo, que orgullosamente ahora tengo dos patrias. Gracias Fidel, gracias Chávez, nuestro Martí, nuestro Bolívar. Gracias a ustedes.
Gracias, Pertierra. Thank you very much, Pertierra, for your words. It's a pity that those who do not speak Spanish may have missed them, but great work. Thank you very much.
Nobody's perfect, and you can't have everybody speaking Spanish.
By the way, thank you. Thank you. It's appreciated. By the way, the book talks about a fifth process of Latin American liberation going on at the moment, and also stresses the need to protect the environment. A human intervention is necessary, it is said in the book, if we are to avert apocalypse, if we are to avert the catastrophe. Then, Whittle, from your point of view, your perception as an environmentalist, we are happy to hear what you have to say. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Juan. It's a great honor to be here today. I should start by saying my Spanish is not nearly as good, so I'm only partway through the book, but so far so good. Environmental Defense Fund has been working in Cuba for 11 years, collaborating with scientists from Cuba and environmental officials on how to protect ocean ecosystems and biodiversity. Those of you who have been to Cuba know what a rich and beautiful place Cuba is. It's truly spectacular in terms of our region. I'm an attorney, I should say that up front. I work with scientists here in the United States and also with scientists in Cuba. I have run the Southeast Oceans program from North Carolina to Florida, and about 11 years ago, we decided you cannot protect the fish or the fish habitats in the Southeast U.S. without Cuba doing its part. So I was invited to go to Cuba in December of 2000, and I've been going back ever since. My Cuban friends and colleagues have kept the door wide open to collaboration and scientific partnership. The book talks extensively about President Fidel Castro's speech in 1992 at the Rio Earth Summit. And I don't need to remind people in this room that that speech was given during the economic crisis called the Special Period of Peacetime. And in that speech, President Castro embraced sustainability and environmental protection, warning against depletion of natural resources and biodiversity if we did not act globally to preserve the environment, to save our kind. The book illustrates that the goal of saving the environment to preserve our kind is still a very important goal, and the challenges are growing every day. I should mention at the outset that protecting our environment for humanity's sake is not a political issue. It's an issue driven by science that is clear. If anything, politics simply gets in the way and obscures what science is telling us. Let me start briefly by saying that there's no doubt that climate change is the gravest challenge facing our globe. There's no environmental challenge that has more potential to alter the world that we leave our children forever. Environmental Defense Fund is working to reduce the pollution that causes global warming, locally, nationally, and globally. And I know that this issue is of paramount importance in Cuba, being an island nation that is directly affected by sea level rise and other consequences of climate change. But my expertise is the oceans, is the sea. And so I want to speak for just a couple minutes about the health of the world's oceans, which I consider one of our greatest environmental challenges. The oceans are being emptied of seafood as we speak. Overfishing is the biggest reason, but habitat loss and climate change also affect the health of the oceans. 70% of global fisheries are overexploited or have completely collapsed. 90% of large fish like sharks, swordfish, and tuna have been removed from the oceans. And these top predators are extremely important, especially in Cuba, which is renowned for its coral reef ecosystems. These large predators are especially important to the health of those coral reefs and entire ecosystems. In the U.S., only 25% of our fisheries are sustainable. In Cuba, that number is a bit higher, but if trends continue, those numbers will decline if action is not taken soon. Declining oceans is also bad for people. Over 3 billion people worldwide rely on fish and shellfish as an important source of protein. In the U.S., the typical income of a fisherman is 30% lower than the typical worker because of the state of the oceans. And just over the past few years, almost 100,000 fishing jobs have been lost on the Pacific coast due to declining stocks of salmon. Cuba has, over the last 20 years, been an impressive leader in the region in terms of making sustainability a top policy priority, even while trying to rebuild the economy. I believe that Cuba can be a model in the future if it continues its commitment to the environment. After the Rio summit, the Cuban National Assembly established the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Environment, a cabinet-level ministry dedicated to science and environmental protection. And since then has adopted a number of important and far-reaching environmental laws and policies that are every bit as strong as those in this country and the rest of the region. These laws and policies provide a firm foundation for sustainability. Also, Cuba has, in my opinion, world-class scientists in every sphere, including marine biology and other ocean sciences. For those of you who have been there, you already know that Cuba is the most important place in the region for biodiversity. It serves a critical function in maintaining healthy ecosystems. Cuba has a large number of endemic plant and animal species, over 3,000 endemic plant species known just to Cuba. And of course, some of the most impressive coastal and marine ecosystems, miles and miles and miles of undeveloped keys and coastline. One program I would like to highlight in which Cuba is a leader is in protecting its marine areas through marine parks, marine protected areas. Cuba has the goal of protecting 25% of its insular shelf in some form of park. That's remarkable. In the U.S., we protect less than 1% of our marine habitat. So 25%, and the Cuban government has already protected 9%. The most spectacular place I've ever been to in Cuba is the Gardens of the Queen National Park, 5 hours off the southern coast. It was recently featured on 60 Minutes, Anderson Cooper, and it featured the work of Dr. Fabian Pina, a marine biologist in Cuba, whose science is helping scientists in Florida bring back the Goliath grouper, one of the most majestic fishes in the ocean. Cuba also has a long list of environmental challenges and problems, loss of biodiversity associated with deforestation, soil erosion, water pollution, and sea level rise. Over 1.4 million Cubans live in low-lying coastal areas directly affected by sea level rise. I also would be remiss if I did not mention energy. In 2008, I was participating in an international conference in Matanzas on renewable ocean energy. Cuba was a pioneer in renewable ocean energy in the 1930s when it developed this really innovative plant to capture the difference in temperature between low-lying areas of the seafloor and the sea surface. It's called ocean thermal energy conversion, OTEC, and Cuban scientists and engineers are in the process of bringing that technology back. It's clean and sustainable. Oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico, we learned from the BP oil disaster that we're connected. The BP oil spill directly threatened Cuban communities and ecosystems. As Cuba has begun drilling, it's critically important that we work together. Our scientists work together, our managers work together. Environmental Defense Fund is working with partners in both countries to make that happen. It's in the interest of both countries to protect our shores, ecosystems, and communities from potential oil. I should also mention that oil and fossil fuels are really just a bridge to what I think everyone considers a cleaner energy future. Cuba, through its energy revolution, has seen advances in energy efficiency and is also making progress with wind, solar, and other renewable energy sources. So to conclude, I consider in Cuba, but also much more broadly, that the elements of success for a sustainable future come down to the following: good science, good laws and institutions, public awareness and support, money, political will, and international cooperation. I've mentioned science. Cuba has among the best marine scientists certainly in the region, arguably the world. I've mentioned the environmental laws and policies since 1990s. Those are a foundation that should remain and be strengthened in the coming years to make sure that they're up to the challenge that the book talks about. Public awareness and support, it will be critically important that as the economy develops in Cuba and elsewhere, that the public understands and believes in environmental protection and sustainability. The book mentions the importance of social media and environmental education. Those will be critical. Cuban environmental law provides an important role for the public to participate in environmental decision-making. Political will. The political will is very strong right now in Cuba to make sustainability an equal partner with economic development. That truly is remarkable. There are not that many models in the world where an economy, a weak economy, has been, where decision makers have made the environment such a priority. So in the future, as revenues come in from new investments, it's critically important not to sacrifice environmental gains for short-term economic profits. And then finally, international cooperation. As I mentioned, the Cuban government and its scientists have kept an open door. The Environmental Defense Fund have a number of important and interesting projects, everything from protecting shark populations in the Gulf of Mexico to working with Dr. Pina on protecting coral reefs in the southern part of the country. I should mention that Dr. Fabian Pina has recently received a Pew Marine Fellowship, a major environmental prize, awarded for the first time to a Cuban. They have only 5 prizes every year, and there is no one more qualified than Dr. Pina to receive that. But we also need to work together on energy, not only in our backyard in the Gulf of Mexico, but on a common clean energy future, and then finally climate change. So the challenges are great. I believe the opportunities are even greater if we overcome the politics, and I truly commend my Cuban colleagues and friends for their commitment to science, sustainability, and collaboration. Thank you.
As much as the environment is threatened, so is our culture, as much as our minds are threatened by what's coming up. I wonder what our friend Stuart Ashman has to say, being a man involved in the world of culture for so many years. Please, we're happy to hear what you have to say.
I have to say that Dan's a hard act to follow. But first of all, let me say it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you, distinguished guests and audience. I want to thank Ambassador Bolaños, Chief of Mission, for his thoughtful invitation, Minister Abel Prieto for suggesting that I attend, and Deputy Chief of Mission Juan Lamiguero for his kind attention, and of course my friend Jesus Perez for his warm greetings. I'm going to address you in English because I think I can express my thoughts better in English, although las emociones salen mucho mejor en español. The emotions sound much better in Spanish. So as an introduction to my brief words, I want to tell you that I was, as someone that was raised in Cuba, leaving at age 12, an event that was a great adventure and a moment to lament years later. My family moved to New York in September of 1960, not for any political reasons, rather to seek the economic opportunities afforded by the American dream. The arrival of our family in New York was indeed an exciting moment for me, and it wasn't until many years later that I discovered my father's true feelings about this move. After a few years after my father passed away, some 30 years after our arrival in the United States, I was looking through his papers and I found a letter he had written to an uncle he had in Brazil. And in the letter he said, "Dear uncle, we're finally getting to realize our long-held dream of moving to America. But what an inopportune time to be going, because for the first time I see a government with integrity and good ideas here in Cuba." His statement in the letter of a government with integrity was surprising to me, as my father never really expressed that to me. But I do remember his quiet excitement in the middle of all the tumult on January 1st, 1959. That statement, a government with integrity, has been echoed by many over the years, most recently in the words of Santiago Alba during the Feria del Libro when he addressed the Comandante. He said, "For many years I have been leaning on Cuba for the reasons that you have effectively summarized, because it is perhaps the only country in the world whose politics are based on ethical principles." That is to say, those things that we consider the highest human values: healthcare, education, protection of the environment, preservation of our cultural heritage, and artistic expression, to mention a few. As a museum director and worker in the cultural field, I'm particularly aware of the importance of artistic expression and the preservation of cultural heritage as an essential component of the quality of life for human beings, as well as the importance of ethical values, transparency, and accountability as elements to gain and retain the public trust. Artistic expression is a major component of communication. There's much said about communication in the book, and it is the artists and intellectuals that let us know about what is taking place in our societies, whether through the visual arts, poetry, literature, dance, theater, or film. The expression of the creators of these forms is a mirror and a magnifying glass of the climate in a given society. As Fidel stated in his speech to intellectuals on the 30th of June, 1961, seems like a long time ago, but we're all here. Some of us were there. And I quote, "In comparison with the past, it is undeniable that Cuban artists and writers cannot feel as they did in the past, and that the conditions in the past for artists and writers were truly depressing in our country. If the revolution began by bringing a profound change in the environment and in the situation in itself, why suspect that the revolution which brought us these new working conditions might stifle the conditions? Why fear that the revolution would eliminate precisely those conditions that it has brought with itself?" Evidence of this statement is seen in the excellence of Cuban artistic expression in all media. The works of Cacho, Esterio Segura, René Francisco, Aimé Garcia, Diálogo, Juan Carlos Alom, just to cite a few of the visual artists who have achieved international status. Elmo Hernandez, president of the Ludwig Foundation, stated when asked what characterizes Cuban visual art, he said, "The work of Cuban artists is no different than the works you would see in Berlin, Paris, or New York, or any of the other great artistic centers in the world. How is this possible in a small island that for over half a century has been isolated from its neighbor to the north? It's most probably due to the great education system that exists in Cuba, the arts academy system that was created by the revolution, leading to the prestigious Instituto Superior de Arte, akin to America's Juilliard School, and to Fidel's statement again in his 1961 speech. The revolution cannot be an enemy of freedoms, and that if anyone fears that the revolution is going to stifle his creative spirit, that concern is unnecessary and has no reason for being. So now let me say a little bit about my own rediscovery of Cuba and Cuban culture. In 1994, I had the privilege of attending the International Book Fair, FILS, in Guadalajara, Mexico. I noticed that there was a booth from Cuba, and I went there to see what they had to offer. A young black woman with blonde curly hair and those unmistakable Cuban ojos verdes, those green eyes, and I struck up a conversation. She told me she was a bioresearcher. I couldn't imagine that. A bioresearcher in Cuba? How could that be? Well, she introduced me to some representative of Ediciones Vigía, the amazing handmade book publishers in Matanzas who were producing magnificent works of art that contained some of the most important literature happening in Cuba. It was an eye-opener and caused me to want to learn more. In subsequent years, I began traveling to Cuba to visit the Havana biennials and to meet my colleagues in the art world, many times bringing people from the United States to Cuba. One of the pivotal people I met was Pedro Monzon, who was in the Ministry of Culture. He treated me like a long-lost brother. Today, he's Cuba's ambassador to Australia, and I'm proud to consider that he considers me a friend. My subsequent meetings with Monzon catalyzed an exhibit of 100 works by 40 Cuban visual artists and a book that was presented in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and later traveled to Lisbon to much acclaim in both places. I don't want to stray too much from the topic at hand, but I thought it was important to mention these activities to give a background for what I think was an important point discussed in the panel of Fidel con los intelectuales, between he, Abel Prieto, and the other intellectuals that attended. That is the importance of communication, or rather the importance of an impact of miscommunication or inaccurate information. I have led many licensed cultural trips to Cuba for Americans and have always been amazed at the lack of information that these people have about Cuba. In contrast, how much information the Cubans we meet have about the United States. On one of my visits, I discovered my elementary school teacher was still alive, Vivi Perez Cartaya. She was 83. She was moving slowly, but still well-informed. She asked me where I lived, and I told her I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And she said, "Oh, the second oldest city after St. Augustine, founded in 1598, right?" I said, "Well, Vivi, you were the professor, and you still are." I've had that and many other surprising encounters like that one. It's a discovery for travelers to Cuba from the United States that the Cuban people are a satisfied, hardworking, and affable people. For reasons of internal communication in the United States, the American public has very different expectations than what they experience when they arrive in Cuba. That there's so much artistic expression in all media, that it is the general public that attends art events, families, senior citizens, children, all who know the artist and understands what's being expressed or are open to learning about it. I had the privilege of taking a group to a Silvio Rodriguez concert at the Karl Marx Theater. The theater was full of people of all ages. Teenagers with their grandmothers, couples, families with their children, and all of them knew every song and every word to every song. And I knew them too. It was truly what can I say, revolutionary. These artistic expressions communicate the spirit of the Cuban people. We're all aware of the poetry of José Martí and how that has influenced and continues to influence the thought of generations of Cubans and beyond. Likewise, in other parts of the globe, the works from Cuba and other places in Latin America have formed thought and moved spirits. As Rosa Cruz de Silva, the minister from Angola, said in her conversation with Fidel during the panel, "I cannot forget that at age 15 or 16, it was the poem of Latin America, the poems of Nicolás Guillén, of Pablo Neruda that nourished our political formation. The spirit of the Cuban people is undeniably strong. I cannot put into words the kind of feelings that arise in me personally when I experience a performance by young Cubans, a young Cuban choir singing original Baroque music, or when I see a thoughtful art installation at the Havana Biennial. It is truly extraordinary. As a museum worker in the United States, I hope that I can make a small contribution by bringing these artistic expressions to the American people so that they can experience for themselves, without miscommunication, the true spirit of Cuba. For myself, I often have to ask the question posed by Fidel when he quoted Neruda, Padre, le dije, ¿eres o no eres? ¿O quién eres? Father, I said, are you or are you not? Or who are you? And when I ask that question, my answer is a recognition of my duty, which is to communicate with enthusiasm and unending tenacity, to the extent I can, the spirit of Cuba. There's so much positive activity going on in Cuba, and I'm pleased that my colleagues here today will share some of these with you. In all areas, the preservation of the environment, the restoration of La Habana by city historian Eusebio Leal and his team, the education of the youth. The panel is discussing the importance of the preservation of our planet, how important it is for us to recognize that humanity is at risk. Qué pena sería, what a shame it would be. And how interesting that a small island with so many struggles of its own has the consciousness to be concerned about the issues facing the world and humanity. This is yet another interesting surprise which should be communicated widely, as the book does. And another reason why I'm so proud to be here today, sharing these moments of thought and conversation with all of you. I'd like to thank you again, my friend Ambassador Bolaños, Ministro Prieto, and the staff at the Cuban Intersection for this most gracious opportunity. And I'd like to conclude with this brief line that Fidel wrote as a dedication to a book to a school teacher in Santiago de Cuba. Con grandes esperanzas en los jóvenes y que en el mundo siga existiendo. With great hope in the youth, and may the world continue to exist. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stuart, for your kind words. Thank you for reminding us how important culture is. We should never take it for granted. And so thank you very much. Culture is also in danger. The book, by the way, also devotes a large portion of the comments to another major concern, which is war, and how wars are being portrayed to the public, how war has become a daily event that goes unquestioned. And I'd like to give the floor now to our friend Becker, Brian Becker, who I'm sure will have interesting thoughts to share on issues like this. The floor is yours, Becker. Good to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, and I too want to thank the ambassador for the invitation, thank the Cuban people and the Cuban government, and Fidel for having been part of a very important initiative, bringing together the intellectuals of the world to discuss that monumental topic, saving the planet from war, environmental destruction, and giving the title of the book, We Have a Duty to Struggle. And, you know, I think it's so interesting that the Cubans talk to the intellectuals and say, we, meaning the intellectuals, have a duty to struggle, using that kind of language. And it can't help but remind you of the spirit and the language of a certain German intellectual from 160 years ago. He would have considered himself a revolutionist and a fighter, but certainly recognized as the premier intellectual at that time and since, who said philosophers have tried to interpret the world. Our point is to change the world. And so the Cuban people and their leadership have asked, challenged the intellectuals of the world, the people of conscience of the world, to come together not to observe the process of war, not to observe the cause of war or the cause of environmental destruction, but in so observing to prepare a program of action so that these the scourge of war and the scourge of environmental destruction can be resisted, can be overcome. I mean, that is the task at hand. And I think on the question of war, which is what I intend to address, I think we can't identify the evil of war as simply the absence of peace, but to try instead to decipher the fundamental causes of war so that, having identified them, we can address those causes. And I think we are confronting a real crisis right now as the forces of the U.S. military, overtly and covertly and in league and in tandem with the EU and with the NATO countries and with the Israeli regime, are preparing for a multifaceted assault against the sovereign government in Iran. And we have to look at that, I think, as a case study and say to ourselves and to identify the problem: what is driving the United States and the NATO powers to yet another war in this oil-rich, geostrategically important region? A war, as Fidel has pointed out over and over again in his reflections, and as the Cuban media has tried to alert, a war that could have catastrophic consequences, not simply for Iranians, not simply for the people of the region, but indeed for the entire world. So let's use Iran quickly as a case study and look at the facts, because from those facts we can derive a pattern and an understanding of what's causing this, with the idea of having a remedy. The U.S. and Israel and the NATO powers are asserting that Iran is a nuclear menace, or is about to become a nuclear menace to its neighbors and perhaps to the world. But let's look at the facts. Iran does not possess a nuclear weapon. Iran belongs to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran is the most inspected country in the world, having IAEA monitors come in and roam around with video monitors and on-site individual inspections over and over again. Iran has never started a war. At the same time, those who are menacing Iran, who are imposing economic sanctions of the most severe type, and preparing for overt and covert operations, have ample numbers of nuclear weapons. The United States has 10,000 nuclear weapons, 7,800 of which are deployed. The U.S. has spent $7 trillion on nuclear weapons since 1942. The United States is the only power in the world that's ever used nuclear weapons, and it did so when it incinerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The United States spends $1 trillion a year on war. $1 trillion a year on war, more than all the other countries in the world combined. Israel, that treats Iran as an existential threat to its existence, has 200 to 300 nuclear weapons, does not belong to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, does not allow IAEA inspectors into its country to monitor its nuclear programs. Likewise, Britain and France, too, have hundreds and hundreds of nuclear weapons. So, if Iran isn't really a nuclear menace, if in fact it's simply a targeted country, what drives the endless animosity and antagonism against Iran? We believe in the Answer Coalition that the real reason that there is such animus towards Iran and there's the growing danger of war is not because Iran has nuclear weapons, nor is it because Iran has a sordid history on human rights. I mean, the United States supports the most anti-democratic governments anywhere in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, for instance. That's not the cause. The real reason is, in 1979, Iran had a revolution, overthrew the proxy puppet client government of the Shah, expelled the CIA from its positions of authority, was able to nationalize its own oil and take possession of that oil and use that oil and its resources for the development of Iran, and that Iran has emerged over the last 3 decades in this resource-rich, geostrategically important region as an independent government. And because it is an independent government, it has been targeted by the former colonial powers and the imperialist powers for destruction. When we look at what the source and danger of war is in the contemporary world, we have to identify the cause, not simply the inability of people to live in peace, but the inability of a particular social and economic order, world capitalism, and in this case led by the United States, is being unwilling to have a live and let live attitude with other governments should they try to assert their own independence, control over their own land, labor, and resources. And so we look back at the past 60 years, and you see in 1950 the United States invaded Korea, and according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, 5 million Koreans perished who would not have otherwise perished. And then 8 years later, the U.S. launched the war in Vietnam, and millions of Vietnamese died. In 1965, the United States invaded the Dominican Republic. In 1982, the United States invaded Lebanon and bombed it. And then a few days later, invaded Grenada. In 1989, it invaded Panama. In 1990, it invaded and bombed Iraq. In 1992, it intervened in Somalia under a humanitarian guise, and 10,000 Somalis died. In 1995, the United States and NATO began bombing Bosnia. In 1999, they dropped 23,000 bombs and missiles on Yugoslavia until Kosovo was finally taken over by Western powers. That was 1999. In 2001, there was the war in Afghanistan. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq. And then in 2011, the bombing of Libya under the pretext of defending civilians under Resolution 1973. I mean, you look at this history of the last 60 years, and you can see that it is war after war after war by the same economic and social order that seeks to maintain the global status quo that allows it to aggregate riches and keeps most of the world's people in poverty. And so when we identify, as the book does and as the Assembly does, the need to eliminate war, we have to identify the source and the cause of war, which we would say is the maintenance of a global economic order, world capitalism, that thrives on and makes war inevitable. And that is, not ironically, the same social and economic order that puts profits first and puts environmental protection last, that removes all obstacles that remain in any way an impediment to the free flow of capital. We have to, as we struggle for peace and a struggle to save the planet, recognize that the powerful forces of global capitalism must be confronted not just in the periphery, but here where they have the central part of their power and their authority. We can see in the Occupy movement, we can see in the movements that are spreading across Europe by poor people and working people and young people, the prospects for a new world, the prospects for change, and recognizing that as we fight against income inequality, as we fight against the disparity that allows not just the 1%, but the 0.11% that controls so much, that we almost must connect that struggle with the fight to save the planet from environmental catastrophe and from the scourge of endless war. Again, we thank the Cubans and the intellectuals who gathered in February in Havana. We hope to be able to promote this book. It's out now, I think, in English as well as Spanish. I think it's a great opportunity to use this as a platform to bring the message of peace and environmental protection and to root it in a bigger, more important, and dominating political context. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. I'd like to thank the panel. The book will soon be in English, if it is not already in English on the web. This is an online presentation of the book, which means the book will be there, available for all. It is a major tool in creating awareness on issues that sometimes are portrayed as the normal state of affairs, and it is not. We have a few copies of the book that's already circulating in Spanish for the delight of our friend Pertierra here, and we will be happy to share them with you. This is a rough, unedited version. You can certainly, if not now, most likely tomorrow. Now they're telling me it's available, a more finished piece of work of this book, which we at the Cuban Interest section, in the name of Ambassador Jorge Bolaños and the staff, invite you to read and share and think. This book is food for thought, and it should be read with care by all who are concerned about what surrounds us and how to preserve it from collapse and catastrophe. We thank you all for being with us here today, and looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you very much for your words, and all the best to you all.